Welcome to the latest episode of Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Dr. Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School. Today we are discussing the escalation of trans segregation from society and anti-trans government policy as something of a follow-up to our episode about a year ago on the For Women Scotland Scottish Ministers case that kicked this process into overdrive in the UK. We are focusing on the UK, but we are seeing this happen in the US and in other countries as part of a global resurgence in authoritarian fascist politics. So this is not exclusive to the UK, this discussion. In terms of who's here to discuss it with me, we have our wonderful guest, Dr. Sandra Duffy, who is a lecturer in law at Bristol University, Dr. Senthorun Raj, who is a reader in human rights law at Manchester Metropolitan University, and Adrienne Ringin, who is a PhD scholar at La Trobe Law School. Before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we should say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. But before we get down to business, our traditional and possibly most important first question, Adrienne, Sandra, what's your drink?
Well, I will kick it off. Even though it is evening here, I'm not much of an alcohol beverage person, so I have just a standard peppermint tea. And just with the tea bag, I'm very sorry, Tamsin.
Oh,
I
my
know.
soul
I'm
is
sorry.
hurt.
Well, for myself, I am a bit of a fruity queen, as people will know. So I enjoy a strawberry daiquiri.
Lovely, love it. Sandra, what have
Uh,
you got?
it is lunchtime here in the UK, so I'm not currently imbibing. But when I am, I do like a mezcalita.
Lovely. And for this recording, since it's a chilly Canberra evening, I have got a Winter Wonderland Rooibos tea, which is a green rooibos with cacao nibs and cinnamon and bits of cinnamon through it. So it's delicious. Now, none of you have been on the pod before, apart from a roadshow appearance from you, Adrienne. So we usually start by asking our new guests, how did you get into international law and what career path brought you to your present job? So tell us about your careers.
Oh, well, I will go again. I'm so sorry. So I, like many of the guests who've been on the pod before, my pathway here took a rather sideways stepping route. So I did my Juris Doctor at the University of Melbourne, and pretty much knew as soon as I walked through the door that I was going to not be many types of lawyers. Um, and I took an elective with Dr. Rosemary Gray and Jonathan O'Donoghue called the International Criminal Justice Clinic. And that was me finally finding law that made sense to me and I was actually quite passionate about. And the clinic was brilliant because we followed live ICC cases and had to report on them under the guidance of Rose and Jonathan, which was just brilliant. Unfortunately, after I completed the JD, I couldn't get a job in international criminal law. It just seemed very hard and might have needed me to go without money, which at that point I couldn't really afford to do. So I ended up doing some employment law with the Fair Work Ombudsman and then sort of roundabout jobs here and there. And then at the end of 2021, I sort of just needed a full reset. So I went back to hospitality and on a whim, I emailed Dr. Rosemary Gray again and just, reached out and said, I loved working on what we were working on. Is there any chance you have any research work that I could assist with? And miraculously, she did. And that turned into the Feminist Judgments Project, the International Criminal Court Reimaginings Project, with Dr. Casey McLaughlin, Dr. Louise Chappell, and now Dr. Suzanne Varel and Rose Gray. And I loved it so much. And then Rose said to me, if you want to stay in this area, I think you're going to have to do a PhD, which led me to the phenomenal Madeline Chiam at La Trobe University. And now I'm completing my PhD. I'm in my third year, so hopefully over soon. And yeah, working on the Rome Conference of 1998. So a bit roundabout, but I got here in the end, and I think that's what counts.
And hopefully over soon is what every supervisor wants to hear from their PhDs because that's an imminent submission sign.
Exactly, exactly. And I should just mention my other supervisor, Kathleen Birrell, as well. So, yes, third year, the slog year, but we're getting there.
Fantastic. Sandra?
Yeah, like Adrienne, I also, after completing my law degree, realized that there were a lot of kinds of lawyer that I wasn't going to be. So I did my LLB at Trinity College in Dublin, and um, it was about 20 years ago now, and it was that point where I don't think I heard the words feminist or human rights until I was well into the degree. Unlike the students that I teach now, luckily, who get more of a variety of outlooks on law, international and domestic. But I remember taking a module on criminology, which had several different critical theoretical approaches, and I also took European human rights in my last couple of years of that. I went back to study after some illness in my late 20s, did my master's with Professor Siobhan Mullally at University College Cork, and then did my PhD with Siobhan at University of Galway in Ireland as well. My PhD is on international human rights law, looking at international systems as well as the post-colonial legal systems of Ireland and India. And although I have kind of diverged from the traditional international human rights law path in a lot of the writing I'm doing at present, that is still kind of my baseline when it comes to law. So it was human rights that brought me back here, very much so.
Fantastic. Sen?
Yes, I mean, just picking up on where Sandra left off, my entry point into international law really came through activism. So when I started university again in law school in Sydney, I joined the Amnesty International Society, and wow, did that open up a whole series of opportunities and worlds for me as someone who was really passionate about various social justice and human rights issues, but never really had a platform to sort of realize those passions. And when I joined Amnesty as a kind of exuberant and precocious, perhaps, student, I explored various issues relating to asylum, migration, gender, sexuality. And I became really interested in how we might use law, international law, domestic law, and non-legal routes in order to pursue the flourishing, if you like, of queer, trans, racialized, and other minoritized people. So, yeah, for me, my story is very much one of activism and is still one of activism. So, yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Well, and to quote our everyone's favorite Dioto,
Yes,
activism is critique and critique is activism, especially academic critique. So
absolutely. Have to pay homage to the wonderful Diodo.
exactly, and you're still exuberant, so that hasn't gone
Thank
about.
you.
I can't comment on the precociousness, but you're definitely still exuberant. All right, so on to our main discussion. So recently in the UK, and as already noted, elsewhere in the world, we've seen a significant ramp up in anti-trans policies that have caused alarm among NGOs, scholars, and the queer community. So, first off, can you give our listeners an overview of what's going on here and what's driving it?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
can start on this
oh,
if that's sorry.
Sandra, did you want to kick things off? Go
No,
ahead.
Sam, go ahead. Go ahead. We'll edit a little bit of awkwardness out.
I like a bit of awkwardness. I was just going to say, I think what we've been witnessing over the last few years is acceleration of authoritarian politics that is utilizing anti-trans narratives, anti-migrant narratives, ableist narratives, as well as many others, in order to basically, pursue very aggressive politics against minoritized people and shore up this kind of very aggressive white patriarchal nationalism, basically, to put it mildly. So, my own experience as a migrant in the UK and who's been living in the UK actually for about 10 years is just how rapidly this kind of retrenchment for trans and non-binary people has been when I first moved to the UK, for example, I remember the then Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May talking about self-declaration of gender as being fairly uncontroversial and policy for the then Tory government. And now self-declaration is seen as some sort of radical intervention when we know it's not. And not only that, we've seen a stripping away of legal protections in relation to equality law, the erosion of the gender recognition certificate by virtue of some of the legal decisions that you've already covered, Tamsin, in previous podcasts, and also the kind of erosion of healthcare for trans people generally, but particularly for young trans and non-binary folks as well in the UK. And I think in order to really understand the velocity of these changes, you have to think about it in relation to the broader fascistic politics that is taking hold not just in the UK, but globally, being spearheaded by various lobby groups and think tanks and media outlets that are aggressively pursuing a sort of outrage economy that is seeking to monster trans non-binary people, as well as migrants and other minoritized groups as well.
Certainly, I think that sums it up really well and is a very good sort of macro look at what's going on in the UK as well as elsewhere. I mean, you can trace a lot of the rhetoric that is coming out at the moment around trans and non-binary people back to the emergence of the concept of gender ideology, even in the 1990s, around international human rights movements, around UN summits, around Beijing, Vienna, etc. Um, I would also kind of just zooming in on what's happening with trans and non-binary people in the UK. Like you say, Theresa May was announcing back in 2017 that self-ID should be part of the way that trans and non-binary people interact with the law. And I think the backlash to that certainly kicked off a certain amount of the organizations and that we see in this sphere today. And the backlash to the proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, which would have liberalised it and taken away some of the more pathologizing and administratively burdensome elements of it. But I think there is a broader narrative around trans and non-binary people, which is essentially the UK legal systems and the UK in general's objection to difference. And whether that be difference due to migration, whether it be difference due to ethnicity, whether it be difference due to gender identity or gender modality, then the UK is not a friendly place for people who are diverging from the white cis heteropatriarchal norm. And I think as well that a lot of the sort of media capture by a certain narrative around this, a trans exclusionary narrative, has allowed for that discourse to become a lot louder than it would otherwise have been. And it almost gives permission for people to be their worst selves in many ways, because it allows for those viewpoints to be enlarged and put upon a national stage. And then you have things like the campaign by For Women Scotland to get that case to the Supreme Court in the first place, which again was a lot louder than a case like that should perhaps be, would perhaps be if it wasn't given such an elevated media platform or political platform as well. So I do have to say that there is a very a minority but loud strain of socio-political and media discourse in the UK, which has enabled this very much as well, and made the UK quite a friendly environment to be trans exclusionary in, which is unfortunate, of course, for all those of us who are having to live there and live through it.
And it probably doesn't help that there is, unnamed billionaires financially backing that trans exclusionary discourse and outrage.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just going to add as well, Amnesty International UK recently released a report mapping the sort of anti-trans narratives and lobbying that had been taking place over the last 5 years. We're talking 17,000 media articles, many of which amplify anti-trans narratives, exclude trans voices. And we now have over 50 sort of quote unquote gender critical slash anti-trans organizations operating in the UK now, when prior to 2017, there were only really about three or so that were sort of specifically operating under that kind of umbrella. And, as you've just mentioned there, Tamsin, it's a question of where has this money come from and who is funding it?
Yeah, and I'd also note kind of at the global level, noting that this is not relevant just to the UK. We've seen the International Olympic Committee and other major global sporting organizations go back to debunked and outmoded sex and gender testing for the next sets of major things in an effort to supposedly protect women by engaging in massive invasive tests on them from trans people sneaking quote unquote into competitions unfairly. So this is not just we're talking about the UK here as a focal point here, but this is not just about the UK.
No, absolutely. I probably will just add it as well, like and from the Australian experience in particular, we've got a minister in Queensland who has just ruled that, puberty blockers need to be put under review for everyone under the age of 18. And even though that was been overturned time and time again, that just keeps getting put into place. And the unfortunate thing is right, it's targeting our most vulnerable in our communities and people who don't have a voice at a ballot box or anything like that. So yeah, it really is now like a global problem that seems to, want to limit what, we can think for ourselves of who we are.
It is, and it also works transnationally as well. To bring it back to kind of the European context, I'm thinking about at home in Ireland, where we have um, self-ID gender recognition since 2015. And that's been working absolutely fine. There's been no problems with it. But the issue is their access to healthcare. There are very few doctors, endocrinologists, etc., working on trans healthcare in the Irish context. A lot of people would have gone to the UK, but the UK trans healthcare system is now also falling apart. And for children, there is essentially no trans healthcare in either Ireland or Northern Ireland at the moment, which is really worrying. And as you say, the trans youth are a minority within a minority and possibly the most vulnerable of all. Um, I wrote an article recently with a friend, Cal Horton, who works on childhoods and trans children in particular, and we were writing about trans childhood during a moral panic, and some of the citations, some of the quotations that Cal got from their interlocutors were just incredibly striking when talking about puberty blocker bans and the way that that affects children in particular. And I just think that there is a concerted effort here in a very Section 28 like way to block the trans community off from its youth, essentially, and to make sure that those youth don't see a trans future where they can thrive and be themselves. And I think that's a really worrying thing for the kids of today and also for the trans community of tomorrow, because we know from the queer community what happens when we're cut off from our elders. and when we lose our elders. And I think that's just a particularly worrying dynamic that's happening at the moment in the UK, but also further afield.
And for our listeners, in terms of the scale of what we're talking about, what this does to trans youth, um, Matteo Bassetti, in his chapter in Queer Encounters with International Law, noted that a recent study found that more than half of trans and non-binary youth had considered suicide as an alternative to what's going on. So this is not insignificant in terms of the impact it has on on the trans youth and trans community. That's why we're talking about it. So that's kind of the situation. It's pretty grim and, quite frankly, clearly a bigoted and queerphobic mess. So, but how do all of this sit against the human rights obligations of the states that are engaging in this conduct? Like, there's a lot of human rights law, both in a European context, in terms of there's a lot more jurisprudence in a European context, but also in an international context under the ICCPR and other international human rights law. How do these policies and domestic laws that we're seeing proliferate sit against those obligations?
I mean, just to kind of start things off at a very high level, we're seeing neglect, really, to put it very bluntly, when it comes to various human rights obligations states have towards trans and non-binary people. What's particularly worrying was the recent UK Supreme Court judgment basically ignored all of that European Convention on Human Rights jurisprudence uh, from, 20, 30 years ago, right? What we've seen from that judgment is a complete erasure of human rights arguments dismissed in favor of this kind of legal fiction around sex, kind of coded through a statutory interpretive framework, which again is not particularly astute because it doesn't consider the human rights obligations which it's meant to consider. And I think one of the most telling features of this is how we've ended up now in the UK with guidance that basically segregates trans people and positions them effectively as a quote unquote third sex, right? Forcibly so, in a way that the very famous Goodwin and the UK decision said that you shouldn't do. And so I think what we've ended up with is something flagrantly in violation of trans and non-binary people's rights. But unfortunately, because of the political, media, and social environment, those human rights obligations have basically been completely obscured from view. And to the extent that they're even acknowledged, are seen as, well, we've got a very important obligation to quote unquote, as you were saying earlier, Tamsin, to protect women. And that very kind of crude and insidious argument is being mobilized through human rights language around, protection from violence and discrimination, which is all very important, of course. Gendered violence and discrimination is a reality. But of course, in the way these debates get framed, we see trans rights and women's rights placed in an unhelpful, polarizing opposition, when, as we know, a lot of feminist scholars have pointed out for decades that gender justice requires sort of gendered self-determination, and returning to a biologically essentialist view of what it means to be a woman is enormously dangerous. For feminist politics and for bodily autonomy and gender justice. And Sandra's written quite extensively on this, so I'll just hand over to Sandra to continue the detail.
Thanks, then. Yeah, I was just thinking while you were speaking there about the Goodwin example of saying that trans people shouldn't be left to live in an intermediate zone between the sexes, essentially. Now, obviously, as Goodwin was in 2002, the European Court of Human Rights was talking very much about people who had received gender affirming care, particularly surgical interventions. But the European Court has obviously also taken away the requirement for surgery in AP Garçon and Co. in 2017. So I think the position that we're in the UK now is essentially we're almost gone back to pre-Goodwin, where trans people are left in a situation where gender recognition is no longer entirely operative. The ILGA Rainbow Map, which came out a few months ago, stated that the UK no longer had a functioning gender recognition regime in the wake of For Women Scotland because obviously the discrimination protections on the basis of sex for trans people on the basis of certified sex were taken away by that judgment. And I think Sen is absolutely right to say that the human rights obligations that countries have are being ignored in favor of trans exclusionary narratives that suit the particular people who are in power. I'm thinking in particular of certain rights under many different conventions. So if we're thinking about ICCPR, we're thinking about the right to privacy as well, which I believe you could say is being contravened currently by the United Kingdom's system in the wake of For Women Scotland. If we're thinking about, the international human right to health, etc., trans people are just not receiving healthcare on a par with cis people in many countries across the world at the moment as well. I'm also thinking of other countries which we haven't mentioned so far, which are also disregarding the human rights commitments that they have voluntarily, implemented, whether that be domestically or internationally. I'm thinking of India in particular and the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Amendment Bill, which was passed this year, which essentially took away many of the options for self-declaration that had been put into law in the wake of the Nalsa versus Union of India judgment in 2014. The 2019 Act, which followed that, was an immensely flawed piece of legislation, but it has actually been made worse in the wake of the amendment bill in 2026. Um, the Indian constitution contains quite strong human rights provisions, and these were cited very much by the Supreme Court in the Nalsa judgment back 12 years ago as reasons why trans people should have self-determination and autonomy over who they are. But that seems to have been left behind by this current government, Modi's government in India. And just looking at different examples of places around the world where human rights have been sort of set aside very much by governments in a search for sort of trans exclusionary legal and social changes, which are immensely regressive and contravene, I would say, the human rights commitments that these countries have made.
Adrienne, did you want to add anything to that at this stage?
Well, I suppose the glaringly obvious refusal to abide by human rights standards and things was Australia's recent declaration to not take on any of the queer or LGBTQ plus recommendations that the UN had handed down, and they just have decided that none of those recommendations are going to be taken on. So I think it's really interesting that we do have these broader international human rights obligations. And then even internally, domestically, we've got, our Human Rights Commission. Australia doesn't have, a Bill of Human Rights, but lots of our states do. And even within those mechanisms, there doesn't seem to be an avenue for reprieve for our community at this moment, which is quite devastating. And being it is such a small community in, population sense, it's one of the avenues that I would like to think is always sort of reliable and is just seems to be crumbling in the current environment. And yeah, I think that's quite shocking. And I think, sometimes it's, as an Australian observer, you can look to America, you look to the UK, and then to, be confronted with, some reports and some very confronting statistics of what's happening in your own backyard. It does feel a little bit like, oh gosh, we hold these things we hold ourselves up as quite a good democratic country, good in inverted commas. And yeah, the reality is that for many of our community, it's just not.
Yeah, and I will note on one little bit of happy news from Australia is the Giggle and Tickle appeal, which is the best case name ever, affirmed transgender self-identity as the law of the land and as gender as it's understood in the Sex Discrimination Act as being the gender you identify as. So that was at least a small bit of good news, but that was from the courts. That wasn't from the politicians or the actual legal kind of legislative apparatus. So, but that was a small bit
I
of
mean,
at least good news.
building on that as well, recently as well, One Nation has been on the rise here,
Oh,
and I think a
Jesus.
little bit unwittingly, Pauline Hanson has actually stirred a response. So, in her now famous press club speech, she mentioned that there was the transgender insurgency, which is now united, as we do, and is promoting that and actually, yeah, doing some really great fundraising around spreading truth where lies and misinformation and disinformation has been constant. So I think there are some really strong grassroots movements moving out, which of course should be celebrated, because without those movements, it does look a bit bleak, our outlook.
And I think one of the fantastic things that's come out of all of this darkness is, as someone who's very dedicated to public legal education, etc., the fact that so many people now are learning about human rights law, learning their rights, learning what they are entitled to, and we're creating this sort of critical mass of trans people who are all very angry, very legally astute and very able to take on the system in whatever way that that manifests, whether that be through hopefully lawfare, etc., through getting involved in activism and advocacy, whether that be hopefully running for politics, running for political office as well. I think if there's anything good that's come out of it, it's been the sort of the unification of a community in a way that is particularly strong, I think, and an activist base that can come out of this. So transgender insurgency in Australia, we have what was it, transgender extremists in the US at the moment as well. And then obviously the various things that we've been called in the UK too. So there is a very strong community base there that has been very much coalesced in the wake of some of the recent backlash to our rights too.
Yeah, you're doing something right when someone positions you as having an agenda. You become the gay agenda, the trans agenda, the queer agenda, and we all just wear them on t-shirts or get them on badges. I know I do.
Yeah, the
Mhm.
the gender agenda.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we do know
The,
how to merch.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Look, I gotta say, like the trans insurgency is like I'll bake cookies for you. Like insurgency everywhere. For the trans insurgency, I'm here for it. So
Mm.
we have like these very clear manifest human rights violations. We're looking at particularly in the UK, and the US, we're looking at like active segregation from society the trans the trans community from mainstream society and kind of as a form of segregation erasure. At what point do these sorts of like manifest human rights violations cross over to being atrocity crimes? Because like I'm thinking, crime against humanity, you have the widespread and systematic government policy, and thinking, what point do we have to start asking the question about when these violations cross that threshold?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it's one of these opportunities that we have to really look at the international law that we have and consider new avenues and ways to think through it. So, of course, when we're talking about atrocity crimes, we're talking about four mainly, right? We're talking about genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. So, like any crime, domestic crime, there are these elements and thresholds to be met. But I think also taking a step back, I think it's also important to think about who we want to hold to account as well, because for all of these crimes, we do have the different institutions and different mechanisms and things like that. So we're thinking about holding like a state to account, and we might be going through something like the International Court of Justice. We've got the Genocide Convention, and the Geneva Conventions and things like that. If we're looking at the individual, then we're looking at the International Criminal Court. And then, of course, we have barriers. Have we signed up to the Rome Statute? So, for example, Australia is, the UK has. And then we're looking as well, maybe, under universal jurisdiction, if it's in your domestic legislation, that's also an avenue that we can think through. But I think, like, from those four crimes that we're thinking about, we're really probably looking at trying to look at the threshold questions for crimes against humanity and potentially looking at using the language of genocide. Leaving aside aggression and war crimes because we just don't fit probably in those two categories.
Well, and the
Um,
reason, and just kind of the reason that doesn't fit is we know from Tardich that war crimes requires there to be an armed conflict, and that's a question of fact. And there is nothing, despite the language of insurgency, or what have you, that would constitute factually an armed conflict with a trans population as belligerents to an armed conflict. So there's a real technical level there, which is why we can set that aside. And aggression we can set aside because there's been no invasion of a trans state, which, so that's why for our listeners who aren't there, why we can just ignore those two crimes. Sorry,
and
I'll let
know
you
those
keep
two.
going.
No, that is incredibly helpful. You forget, you skip steps. But I suppose so what I've always looked at it from, and is a point to look for. So looking at something like if we're holding the state to account, we'd have to looking at the Genocide Convention. The Crimes Against Humanity Convention is currently under consideration, but we don't have a convention. So if we're looking at charging a crime against humanity, we're probably going to have to go to the ICC and looking at a specific individual. Now, I mean, for things about genocide, as unfortunately I'm sure many of us are aware of now, we've got the intent to destroy in whole or in part a group as such through dedicated acts. Unfortunately, we only have those four acts. So, four groups. So you'd have to be part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And social and cultural are not captured and never have been captured under that particular iteration. So there's an avenue there to advocate to, broaden that scope. But as it stands, no court has, done that so far, which then turns us to crimes against humanity under the ICC. So Crimes Against Humanity was brought in to fill a gap of when governments were targeting their own people. So we stepped aside from state sovereignty and we said, no, if a state is doing it to their own people, we should be able to impact that in some sort of way. So when we're looking at the particular definition, we'd be looking at under the Rome Statute, and we're looking there at Article 7, and it's any of the following actions, so there are 7 acts, when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. And in this, we've got these threshold questions, which really frustratingly haven't ever been properly outlined or boundaried. We can have cases that we can look to break it down, but there, even in the Rome Statute, even in the elements of crimes, there isn't any specific, cross this red line type issue. So I've sort of had a look into it and sort of thinking from our queer perspective and thinking about our trans and non-binary civilians that are out there. We could probably class them as a group, and civilians, we're looking at people who are not engaged with armed forces or military or anything like that. So it's widespread or systematic. We're looking at the natural English meaning of those words. We can look to cases of acquiesce or tadich from the ICTY and ICTR to sort of build in what that actually ends up looking like. We need it to be widespread and systematic. So even built within that, we're looking at multiple acts and we're looking at multiple victims. Where we're probably looking at falling down slightly is being caught in under any of the acts. So as I mentioned, there are A to K acts. So we're looking at things like murder, extermination, enslavement, severe deprivation of liberty, persecution. There's this whole list. Where we could be thinking about having the civilian population targeted by something is something like persecution, because that's persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity. And then it includes gender here. So gender is listed as a group that can be listed for persecution. With persecution, we also need it connected to one of the other acts. So it needs to be murder based on this act or torture based on this group, sorry. So what we're looking at is you're murdering someone because of their belonging to a group. So we'd still have to look back to any of these acts to see what we would call this kind of policy. And this is where it can get a little bit tricky as well. So when we're looking at what it could be, we might be considering something like, for example, would we be looking at there is one that's sort of comparable gravity. So we have to, it could be any other act, any inhumane act, but it has to be of comparable gravity to the other ones that we have listed. So comparable gravity to murder, comparable gravity to sexual violence and things like that. Extermination, for example, you have to mention, you might be looking at there for like medical care, but what is the policy? Is it actually about medical care? Then like apartheid, unfortunately, is only listed as a racial aspect under the Rome Statute. Enforced disappearance, that relates specifically to the arrest, detention, or abduction with. So it's one of those things where there's probably nothing that catches it right at this moment. But what I think is interesting is there have been 3 cases in front of the ICC recently on gender persecution. And this was when we have looked at men being murdered or tortured for belonging to an ethnic group, but it was also based on them being men and being perceived as people who could be soldiers in the future. So that was, we've got the cases of Abdelrahim, and then also the case of Said. So those 2 cases are looking at men and as people who could be perceived as soldiers being tortured and killed. We also had the case of Al-Hassan. Now, this was gender persecution based on women and girls, and it didn't come through. So it wasn't found in that area because they couldn't necessarily say that the sexual violence did take place. So there's progress in this area and looking at gender persecution. I think where we're looking at the current situation and the global environment with how governments are treating the queer communities and the trans and the non-binary folk is that it's just sort of not hitting any of the mechanisms that are currently in place. As I mentioned, though, the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty is currently being debated and negotiated, and we're looking at 2028 and 2029 for the full treaty negotiations to come in, like take effect and really come down to the nuts and bolts of it. So there has been talk there for things like gender apartheid, for example. And so that's moving apartheid out of the racial vision that it has been attached to historically and moving it into a gender space, which is where something like this may come into play a bit more. I'd also be flagging that, as I mentioned, persecution has mentioned gender. Under the Rome Statute, we have a very interesting definition of gender that does say male or female, but in the context of society, it was constructed ambiguity to get that in and get that through. So there are all of these other policy papers coming out of the ICC as to how to interpret gender, which is much more favourable to how many of us see gender in 2026. So there's some movements here, I guess, is what I'm indicating. When we're looking at these threshold questions, we have to be asking things like, well, widespread, are we looking at it being affecting this group of people in a widespread way? Is it a lot? Is it happening constantly? Is it systematic? Having all of those questions answered, can we specifically say that this is a civilian population? But I think at this moment for us, where the difficulty lies in meeting those thresholds is finding an act that can successfully be attached to persecution. And so I'd definitely be flagging situations like what's happening in the UK, America, and Australia, and flagging them and be gathering evidence and seeing the effects. Because later down, when those acts maybe become a bit more apparent, maybe we can land a bit more on some of these other more traditionally understood crimes. And by attaching persecution to that, that will tip the threshold because crimes against humanity doesn't need a military conflict. So that was very long-winded and very convoluted. So it's more than happy to re-go over anything that didn't quite land there.
I'm going to let Sandra and Sandra chime in first before I have a couple of follow-up questions, but I'll let Sandra and Sandra chime in first.
I was just going to say, I mean, Adrienne, you did a great job scaffolding the legal frameworks that would apply to this consideration. So I'm not going to relitigate, pun intended, any of that. But what I do want to kind of flag is the fact that, you know, when we think about the kind of the social and political dimensions of this, alongside the international legal dimensions, we begin to see the concerted ways in which trans and non-binary lives are being erased through deliberate acts of censorship, forced detransition, conversion practices. And when we begin to piece together these different interventions, we see a concerted effort to basically remove trans people from existence. Now, that's not going to happen, obviously. We're seeing the insurgents, right? So we've got a lot of resistance, we've got a lot of organizing and so on. But I think what we also have to remind ourselves is that a lot of the rhetoric that's being mobilized at the moment is laundered through logics of care and concern. And, you know, we often think of genocide and crimes against humanity and, you know, crimes of aggression, always through the language of kind of malice and contempt. Now, of course, that's very much the case with the political and social treatment of trans and non-binary people. But what's curiously different, perhaps, is the way in which that's often framed as concern for women, or, you know, individuals who are sick and confused. You know, rehearsing a lot of what they used to say about gay, lesbian, and bisexual people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I think what we are seeing now is more and more people becoming increasingly aware that these quote unquote, you know, reasonable positions or quote unquote legitimate questions are actually eliminationist logics because they start from the premise that being trans or non-binary is a problem. And if you start from that premise, any question, any comment is always going to be geared in a kind of eliminationist way because it's always being laundered through that very horrific kind of starting point.
I also wonder if there's a use for this kind of language, even if we can't currently hang this on a particular branch of the definition within international law, if there is, as Sen says, I mean, this is an eliminationist strategy, right? This is politicians and lawmakers and pressure groups conspiring to essentially remove us from public life. So I've written recently that it's not just, you know, the right to privacy that's being taken away from trans people, it's the right to the public. It's the right to public participation, to freedom of association and assembly as well, that's being taken away from trans people because if you can't if you are being misgendered on the daily in every aspect of life that you interact with, then you are not again participating on a par with cis people. I do think when I was thinking about atrocity crimes and this um, coming into this recording, I did land in the same place as Adrienne, where it's just there just isn't quite that connection there right now, or that place to put it. But I do think keeping an eye to this is really important, and keeping a note of the fact that this is eliminationist language, that this is eliminationist rhetoric, strategy, politicking is incredibly important for going forward, and like Adrienne said, for evidence gathering as well in the future.
And I think like
So
just drawing on that as well, because the policy papers have come out from the ICC as well, where there is space for that. I think that's why it can be quite useful to use this language, and situate it in there, because the ICC, the Office of the Prosecutor, has given much, like a lot of space, right, for queer people to exist in international law, and so there is that ability and there is that pathway, which can be just useful to have that sort of common language to talk about it.
my follow-up question, and it is a really technical black letter law one, given everything we've spoken about the impact this has upon trans and non-binary people's access to healthcare and mental health, and inducing suicide rates and things like that. Is there scope to hang it um on sub on K, which is other inhumane acts or similar of a similar character, intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health? Is there scope maybe to make a creative argument based upon evidence in that line?
Yeah, that was the final one that I had as a possible one to hang persecution on. As to my knowledge, it's never actually been run from the ICC. I believe at the Special Court of Sierra Leone, that was where forced marriage came in. So they managed to place forced marriage into other inhumane acts, and of course, forced marriage is actually placed within the Rome Statute now. So what we're looking there is this idea of comparable gravity, right? So as policies stand at the moment, you would be making that argument, right? That it is of comparable gravity to the worst crimes in the world, which is, the tagline of the ICC. I think there are some really strong reasons to place it there. I think what we would be drawing on is experiences, um, and trying to draw on the silences in international law, which of course is difficult, because they're silences for a reason. But there is so much work at the moment in reimaginings of international law and finding those silences and pointing out that, for example, the Korean comfort women, and looking at that through a lens of sexual violence, looking at the experience of gay and homosexual people under the Nazi regime. So drawing out where the temporal language didn't allow for the imagination of the creators to broaden the scope, which is sort of what we're seeing with the idea of gender apartheid, right? So when we're thinking about apartheid, it's so intrinsically linked to race. There wasn't scope to think that anyone would segregate on any other means. So this other inhumane acts is very possible, except for the fact that it's never been run before, so it would be new and it would be novel. And I think this idea of comparable gravity, due to what the policy is stating at this moment, right? So I completely agree with Sandra that there is this idea of, this almost enforced disappearance, extermination. It's that kind of language. But is this policy comparable gravity with that? There would be some very intense legal discussion about that. And that's where the debate would lie. So I suppose from my perspective, what I'm looking at there is this evidence gathering, right? What are the mental health reports? Unfortunately, you'd be looking at suicide rates of trans youth or trans, intersex, non-binary people across the board and bringing that to the fore to try and hold someone to account in the future. And this is potentially the ultimate problem with atrocity crimes, right? It's reactive, it's not preventative. And in this time, the language is useful, but the actual decisions maybe not so much due to it's going to be after the fact when so much could be lost for our community.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, this is where the feminist judgments of the International Criminal Court that you were just talking about, Adrienne, can come in handy for some of these judges who may need a little bit of persuasion around how to think about these novel arguments.
Exactly. And miraculously, it's open access to Sen. So, there is no financial barriers for any of our esteemed jurist colleagues to, reach over
Even
and flick through.
even if they are still currently being sanctioned by the US, they can still access it.
We just wanted to share the knowledge that is there. But no, exactly. And the queer judgments, it's the same thing, looking at the law using different lenses, using the language of the law, but drawing on the specific context of, 2026 instead of 1949, can be really useful. So yeah. Also, love the plug. It's great.
And so we are going to need to wrap up because it's been a great conversation, but we have been at it for almost an hour, so we are going to need to wrap up. So, in wrapping up, we usually ask a non-international law question about escape routes, reading, listening, taking your mind off the horror show that is international law's demise. But in season three, I've been given a free hand on this question. So, as a former chef, I'm asking all about food. What is your ultimate comfort food? Where can you get the best version of it? And where can listeners find a solid recipe to make it at home?
All right. Well, I might start with this. So my go-to comfort food has to be a Sri Lankan chocolate cake. And unfortunately for some listeners, the best place to get it is my mother's house, because she makes it. However, I will also do a plug for my aunt, who also makes a brilliant chocolate cake, who's also a chef and has written a cookbook called A Well-Traveled Kitchen. So you can find the recipe for a Sri Lankan chocolate cake in her wonderful cookbook, A Well-Traveled Kitchen.
And next time you come down from Sydney to Canberra when you're over here, you can bring me a slice so that I can get my pastry chef, mutual love on for the Sri Lankan chocolate cake.
Absolutely, Tamsin.
Well, I am more of an improvisational cook, so I don't have a solid recipe for things. I tend to just let it let it happen right in the kitchen. My go-to comfort food is pasta, a good pasta dish, because carbs are king. And I would say that I would happily cook it for you, any of you, if you end up in Bristol at any given time.
Is there a particular type of pasta you prefer, or you just go with the vibes of the day?
Oh, I go with the vibes of the day. I mean, you can't beat a good carbonara done the proper Italian way, really. But it really depends. Fresh pesto is also absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, look, my go-to for pasta for a pasta comfort is a gnocchi bolognese. So, Adrian,
Very lovely. Yeah.
So I really struggled with this question, not because I'm not a foodie, I definitely am, but all of my comfort food definitely comes from before I realized I was gluten and dairy intolerant, which is very painful. But I will say, if I really need it, I will pretend that I'm not, and I will definitely go and down a tiramisu. Um, just we've got a lovely winery just near us that does yeah, like good old fashioned like huge bowl of it scoop, and I just pretend that I will be okay, and inevitably I'm not, but it is worth it, I think, for those moments of bliss.
that's kind of how I felt about developing an egg intolerance. So,
Oh
yeah.
no. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I miss creme brulee. So yeah,
Oh, yes. So good. So good.
so
And like I love, bless my partner's heart, like he rolls with it. But yeah, you got to do what you got to do.
yeah. Well, that is all we have time for. Thank you all so much for coming along. And this really, I think it was really quite a heavy discussion and it wasn't exactly uplifting. So I appreciate you taking the time and the emotional energy to do that. And for our listeners, we will catch you next time. Goodbye.